Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan, with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. Lazar, I'm so glad to be in dialogue with you again. I've missed you so much.
Well, I've missed you too. I've been away in Scotland and the United States. And of course, this being Israel, the news has moved quickly. So think of where we were a month and a half ago and think of where we are now. A lot has happened and there's plenty to talk about.
Think of where we were on Sunday and where we are now. And we're actually going to talk about a little bit of that because we're going to discuss the status of the Abraham Accords, which are celebrating their 5th birthday next week. Lazar is going to talk us through which countries are in the Accords and which were on deck before the Hamas massacre of 1,200 in Israel on October 7th, 2023, that, of course, launched the Gaza War. We're also going to discuss how Israel's recent attempted assassination of the Hamas leadership this week may affect relations with Gulf states moving forward, because, of course, that happened in Qatar. So all of this and more when we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. Lazar, let's rewind the clock. And it's September 15th, 2020. It's a Tuesday afternoon. And what do I see on the south lawn of the White House? What's happening?
So there was, you could have been there even because there was a lot of journalists there. Even the Times of Israel was there. This was before my time, but you would see kind of the same players you have now. You would see President Donald Trump. You would see Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, obviously slightly younger, but the same figures and the same outlook. You would see the Bahraini and the Emirati foreign ministers on the South Lawn with the flags of all of these countries, and they would be heading out together in front of the crowd to sign and speak about these game-changing peace accords or normalization agreements in the Middle East. Really one of the most significant developments and one of the most important positive developments in the Middle East in a long time.
So the first state to sign on was the United Arab Emirates. And take us through state by state, who joined and specifically why these countries.
Yeah. So the first was the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. Now, this is a country that for a long time has been trying to position itself as this haven or this place for doing business. Of course, Dubai is one of the Emirates, also Abu Dhabi. And they try to position themselves as this vision of a safe place for doing business, a place that rejects extremism, a place of physical safety, and a headquarters for international corporations in the Middle East. And that is the vision that they have been trying to promote. There's a lot of very good trust between the royal family and the thin layer of residents who are actually citizens. And of course, they're very, pro-Western, close to the United States. And it was a natural step forward that the next country after Egypt and Jordan, who had their own reasons for making agreements with Israel because they were on the border, they had fought bitter wars. Of course, the UAE is quite far away. It just made sense that given the extensive business ties and quiet government to government ties, that they would be the ones who make this public step and really position themselves as the leaders of this new way forward in the Middle East.
So who joined after that? Who was next?
So you had Bahrain, which is the smallest Arab country, really rather poor when you compare it to the other Gulf countries. And that is a country that has a Sunni royal family. Most of the residents are Shiite. And if you remember, during the Arab Spring, there was some pretty active protest movements that the royal family and the government had to put down. There's a lot of fear about Iranian involvement and Iranian subversion in the country. And much of what happens in Bahrain is dominated by their relationship with the Saudis, because they're this tiny island right off of Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf. They too, they weren't going to be the first, but once the UAE kind of opened the way and opened the path and showed the way, then it was natural that they would be the next one. Of course, this was also a way for the Saudis to kind of, check, test the waters and see how things would move forward. So that was, again, it's a small country, but it's a country that really is looking for ways to stand out itself as its own country, and I'm sure none of it would have happened without the Saudi blessing.
Okay, and then who joined up?
So next you had Morocco, which officially is not part of the Abraham Accords. They had their own set of agreements, but when people speak about the Abraham Accords as a shorthand, they're speaking about Morocco as well. Now Morocco is different. Whereas the UAE and Bahrain, were really just opening up relationships with in 2020. Morocco has long-standing relationships with Israel, and a lot of that comes from the fact that there are over 1 million Israelis of Moroccan heritage. Either they were born there or their parents were, and there's very, very deep cultural connections. And you had Israelis throughout the years from Israel flying back there to visit family sites as tourists, making pilgrimages to the graves of rabbis. And of course, a lot of French Jews are also Moroccan descent. So there was a lot of Jews moving around and Israelis coming through the country. So there was already that lower level kind of social connection that was already set up, which made the relationship a little bit different as well. Now, the Moroccans wanted something from Israel. They wanted our help with the United States, or they wanted this from the United States also, in recognizing their control, their sovereignty in Western Sahara. And that obviously is something that Israel didn't have a problem with. There's a question of what UAE and Bahrain got out of this as well. They, of course, have access to Israeli defense technology. It brings them closer to U.S. Security structures in the Middle East. But for Morocco, it was really a very tangible ask. I will say that Morocco, unlike Bahrain and the UAE, have not upgraded their ties to that of of an ambassador representing them. And I think that won't happen until the U.S. opens a consulate in the Western Sahara, which hasn't happened yet. But this is the multiplayer relationship and the complex relationships that Israel and these countries are part of here, that everyone wants something from the United States, and Israel is a part of that. Now, there was a fourth country, which was the Sudan, who kind of nominally was supposed to join and sign. They never signed. And as the country fell apart politically and security-wise into this ongoing kind of civil war and plenty of social unrest, that just hasn't moved forward. So that is frozen. So when you talk about the Abraham Accords, there's really two countries, but shorthand, it's three. And there was an expectation afterward that this would quickly expand, of course, with the big prize being Saudi Arabia, but that has not happened. Not under the Biden administration, which was not willing to even say Abraham Accords at the beginning, and the Bennett-Lapid government, which came in between the Netanyahu governments. They talked about it all the time. They put a lot of effort into expanding it, but they weren't able to make progress either. So that's where things stood in the period after the 2020 signing.
Now, the big fish is, of course, Saudi Arabia. And just prior to the October 7th, 2023 Hamas invasion, it seemed to me, at least, that signs were pointing that it was going to go ahead. It depended on when, not if. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, we can look back and say that that's kind of wrong because it hasn't happened yet. Sorry. So it turns out to be a much bigger F. I think we're getting way ahead of ourselves on that. If you remember, President Biden was here in, I think it was 2022. And he came to Israel first, and then he flew to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And everyone was getting all excited because they're saying, wow, it's the first direct flight from Israel to Saudi Arabia, which isn't even true because Bush did it. And it didn't mean anything. It was just, the president was flying. So I think that was miscovered. And I think Israelis got way too kind of optimistic about it and didn't realize that even though there were three things that needed to happen, they were all very big things, including some sort of Israeli commitment to a Palestinian state and some sort of process to that. And then there was also the U.S. defense pact that they wanted. So these are some very big lifts that needed to happen. The Saudis were getting what they wanted from Israel anyway, right? So if the Saudis wanted something in terms of intelligence and security from Israel, Israel's not going to say no. If they want access to technology, I'm sure Israel will send it to them. It's not like they need Israeli money, right? They would like some Israeli technology, and I'm sure they can get that anyway. So if they're going to take that step, I think a lot more had to happen. And they would not be joining the Abraham Accords. There's no way that the Saudis are going to be seen as following in the footsteps of the UAE and the Bahrainis. They would call it their own thing, and it would be their own framework, and we'd probably stop talking about the Abraham Accords because this would be so much more significant. But I think we were getting way ahead of ourselves before the war, and we'll talk about, now that the war has happened, where things stand.
Okay, so let's stay in the pre-war period for a little longer. And a lot of the countries that were getting a lot of the buzz were the stans, the Kazakhstan type countries. And what happened with that?
So we have relationships in Central Asia. We've upgraded some. If you remember, I believe it was Foreign Minister Eli Cohen went to Turkmenistan, which is kind of a strange place. So we have actually some pretty decent relationships in Central Asia with the stans. The real big candidates besides Saudi Arabia that were spoken to were even further away. So Indonesia, Malaysia. Indonesia, I believe it's the biggest Muslim country in the world. So that would be significant as well. And that still comes up sometimes. And then other Gulf countries, let's say Kuwait, absolutely a possibility. Oman, which tries to position itself as this mediator country, and Qatar, which was actually a country which had formal and open relations with Israel from the 90s, that survived the Second Intifada and were only cut off in 2009 in the wake of Operation Cast Lead in Gaza. That was seen as a natural candidate as well. People spoke about other ones as well, maybe Iraq someday, as it tries to move away from Iranian dominance. So there's a lot of possibilities, but again, none of those have happened yet. And I really don't think I'm sure nothing can happen as long as this war in Gaza is still going on.
Okay, so let's stay in the pre-war period. One last final question. And do you have any sense of how these accords are working out financially for all the countries involved?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as of in the first year of the war, surprisingly, the trade with all the Arab countries, maybe there was one where it didn't grow, but maybe I believe all the Abraham Accord countries that we spoke about, and I think with Egypt as well, grew astronomically. So I think it was I have to check the numbers, but I think it was a 600% increase with Bahrain, and all of these countries, the trade relationship was growing. Now, that doesn't mean it's exactly where we wanted. It was in certain fields, especially with the UAE. A lot of that is things that are not really being bought from the UAE, but that are going through the UAE from further east. But in general, the business relationship, especially with the Abraham Accords countries, was positive, was enough to keep everyone happy. I think Bahrain would like the Abraham Accords to be a game changer in terms of their economic situation, and Israel could probably put more attention into that relationship. Of course, the UAE is the big prize right now. So that would be helpful if, Israel can only do so much, but if Israel can harness its relationships with countries like the United States and maybe India and some other countries, perhaps in Africa where Israel is doing well, to invest in the Bahrain, I think that would really make the Bahrainis happy. So it was moving forward. There was other problems as well, because there was kind of the Israelis, if you want to say it roughly, were just expecting all this Arab money to pour into Israel, where that's not what these countries wanted to hear. They wanted to see Israeli investment there as well. They wanted to see jobs being created because of Israeli factories being open and Israeli businesses. So there was a lot of learning to still do, especially in the culture of the business world of both of those. But there was a lot of things happening, moving forward on the ground. The ties were widening. There was public visits. There was plenty of public visits. So you had, especially under the Bennett-Lapid government, which is a very easy government to talk to for them, you had the Negev Summit, which was the annual Negev Summit, which met exactly one time. So you had the foreign ministers from these countries, plus the Egyptian foreign minister, come to Israel to meet. You had the foreign ministers going there. You had Bennett go there, Lapid, Herzog, the president. So there was, and you had them coming here, not at the highest levels, but at least ministers. So things were moving. Things were progressing. I should note that in all of the countries, the public support for these accords were dropping even before the war. So there was what to worry about. But in general, I think everyone was happy enough with the way that they were going. And Israeli diplomats were doing quiet work, but hard and effective work in these countries to continue to expand it and to keep things moving forward at a nice clip.
And just one final word on the pre-war period. Of course, tourism opened up for Israelis, and these new routes were amazing for game changers for anyone flying east, but also just to have new adventurous places to explore, or at least their malls.
Yeah, the big one there is Dubai, Abu Dhabi. I will say that the tourism has been in one direction. So you haven't seen Emiratis or Bahrainis or Moroccans coming to Israel. I'm sure some of that is because of dynamics on their side, but I'm sure it's not always the most comfortable to come here from those countries. I think our security obsession gets in the way of a lot of other concerns, which are also perhaps more important to our larger view of security. So it was one way, which is important. It's important that Israelis go there, spend money, make the connections, and throughout, I don't want to say the Emiratis were inviting Israelis to their homes, but they were happy to treat them as to welcome them as tourists, and that was very important as well.
All right, let's go to a short break. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. So let's talk about how October 7th changed things, both in the relationship with the countries who actually had signed on to the Abraham Accords and the possibility for other countries to join up.
Yeah, so these countries, the ones that had signed and any country that would potentially sign, absolutely hate Hamas, see the Muslim Brotherhood and their alliance as the big enemy. Well, on the one hand, also Iran is the other one, and absolutely want to see Hamas and groups like it wiped off the face of the earth. At the same time, the images going into their homes, the homes of their citizens, was of the devastation in Gaza. That made it very, very difficult for them to have any sort of public relationship with Israel. So everyone knew that the relationship was continuing, but in terms of overt visits and overt projects, they really went under the surface. In many places, Israel did not help itself in terms of what some of the ministers were saying and what some soldiers were putting out on their own social media accounts. But we can say that even under these strains and under Israel's reputation taking a dive during this war, that it is clear that these countries have made a strategic decision to normalize with Israel, and nothing's going to tear it apart. Because even if the Gaza war doesn't, I think that is a very important statement. Now, you've seen over the past year, let's say the UAE has accepted pretty high profile Israeli visitors. So you had opposition visitors. So Lapid and Bennett were there, which is a nice way for them to send a signal to the government here. You actually had the foreign minister, Gideon Sar, who was was a very loyal to Netanyahu now, and is not someone who's pushing in any way for a Palestinian state. They hosted him for a visit. You just had Sharon Haskell, who's the deputy foreign minister, there for a conference. So they are willing to host Israelis, even members of the government. I remember at the Independence Day event at the president's residence this past Yom Ha'atzmaut, the Emirati ambassador was there. He was sitting next to the Goldberg Poland family. Had no problem that people, were taking pictures of him being there. So there is some level of visibility that they are willing to have, which I think is a very positive sign. Especially with the Emiratis, you've seen a shift that they have decided that the Palestinian issue, which is something that they were quite actively pushing away and thought that there was something they weren't interested in, and there was even fights with the Palestinian Authority during Corona. They decided that they wanted to take a leading role in the Palestinian issue. So you see the Emiratis have been involved in every type of project in the Gaza Strip in terms of humanitarian. So field hospitals, airdrops, water pipeline, aid workers, funding all sorts of, trucks. They have absolutely been kind of the dominant or the leading player there. Of course, anything they do there has to be coordinated with Israel. That means Israel is speaking to them at every level about this and is letting them take the lead. Israel's not letting every country do everything. So an Emirati airdrop means that their Air Force has to coordinate with Israel's Air Force. And that means Israel cannot fire a single artillery shell, missile, no helicopters, drones can be in that airspace while they're flying through. So that means there's an extensive cooperation military to military. So that is very good as well. There's also the question of, okay, seeing that over the past year, Israel has shown its intelligence and operational capabilities in the region in terms of taking out Hezbollah, taking out the Iranian leadership, striking the Iranian sites. Now, what we're doing to the Houthis. So, on the one hand, Israel has really shown that we have capabilities. We are willing to push back the Iranian axis, and they're all happy about that in terms of these Arab countries. And we are the powerful country in the region. It's better to be on our side than not to be on our side. But there's also some drawback. These countries, say we saw that during the Iranian war, Iran struck Qatar directly, right, at the end of the war. That concerns them. They're always concerned about them being the easy target if Iran wants to get US or Israel back.
Just to jump in about Qatar, of course, it's not that they're striking Qatar per se, they're striking the American air bases in Qatar.
Yep. But it's on Qatari soil, and that is certainly something that is very, very concerning to them. But when in those 2 rounds of Iranian strikes on Israel before that, all these countries were part of that US-backed network to defeat those strikes. So it has deepened the regional security cooperation. It was kind of the coming out party for this US-backed security network, and I'm sure that has only deepened since then. But they do have concerns about what the blowback could be from Iran.
I'd like to go back to UAE for a second. And you mentioned earlier that they weren't so involved in the Palestinian issue, but of all the countries that we've been talking about who are in the accords right now, right? They seem to be the ones who have flexed the most on the diplomatic stage. Meaning, if you remember, in Trump's first term, the UAE basically stopped any kind of talk of annexation, which obviously would have affected the Palestinians very deeply. And then just now, was it last week? Was it 2 weeks ago? Time is so ephemeral right now. UAE spoke with our Jacob Magid to really deliver a message saying how displeased they were and what's going on. So, Lazar, when you say that UAE, out of the three, or 2.5, shall we say, true Abraham Accord countries, has been most vocal in terms of the Palestinian issue?
Now they have been. Certainly when since they were the first ones to make that step, they had to sell it both to their public but also to the region as doing this for the Palestinians, right? In terms of legitimacy. The government had not had not shown that they cared about the Palestinians, and again had very tense relations with the Palestinian Authority up until this war. So that I'm sure that they are not doing this for the Palestinians; they're doing it for their own interests. But there are, they have to pay attention somewhat to the street and to their reputation around the region, and they have definitely made a strategic shift in terms of their involvement in the Palestinian issue.
Okay, let's talk about, before we talk about the attack that happened this week, a few of the other countries that are kind of floating in the air since about July this year. And all of a sudden there was buzz about Syria and Lebanon joining in the Abraham Accords, especially when, US President Donald Trump met with the Syrian leader. So what do you think? In the realm of possibility, out of the realm of possibility, crazy
So,
talk?
so I will note that we had a full peace agreement with Lebanon. They were the second country we had a full peace agreement with them in the early 1980s. That lasted not very long because the Lebanese, if he was prime minister, was killed, Gamayel, and that all fell apart. But we did have a very short-lived peace agreement with them. It's not going to happen anytime soon. The most we can hope for from Syria is some sort of security arrangement, and that they won't attack the Druze, and that they'll keep anyone from hurting us. That's the best we can do with the Syrians, and that hopefully that won't turn into a battleground between us and Turkey in any way. With Lebanon, what we want them to do is to disarm Hezbollah. That process has started south of Litani. There's elections coming up, which really will be important to see how much sway Hezbollah has and how much they're able to prevent their own disarmament. But to get a weak Lebanese government who still has to deal with a still armed Hezbollah to make a peace agreement with Israel. Absolutely not going to happen.
Okay, so let's turn to what happened this week. And on Tuesday of this week, the Israel Air Force attempted to assassinate Hamas's top leadership in Doha when they were sitting down, reportedly to discuss the ceasefire hostage release proposal that was on the table. So this is, of course, caused some alarm among the Gulf states, shall we say, that Israel attacked a sovereign nation in order to get the Hamas leadership. So, Lazar, how are you seeing that this could affect the Abraham Accords relationships?
So I think it's important to note the Gulf countries' relationship with Qatar. In 2017, these countries kicked Qatar out of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, basically did everything short of actually going to war against Qatar. They kicked Qataris out of their countries. So you have 2 weeks to leave, citizens. The Saudis will not let food be delivered from Saudi Arabia into Qatar. And they're the only land border with Qatar, right? This was drastic. They accused them of supporting terrorism, of supporting Iran, of undermining their own stability. It's basically a declaration of war. That lasted for 4 years. There was a reconciliation process in 2021, and you can see how well that process has gone, because these countries now, when Israel struck Hamas leaders inside of Qatar, they all immediately flew to Qatar, put out statements to show solidarity, and put out statements decrying Israel. So if Israel's hoping that they're going to turn on Qatar again, I think those are false hopes. It's a complex relationship, but everyone seems to have made up in the region. Now, how do they see this? Again, it shows Israel's strength, but it scares them. I think you're seeing this discourse emerge in which they were afraid of Iran because of Iran was involved across the Arab world in internal relations of these countries and had proxies that were acting militarily. They see that Israel has acted, well, first in enemy countries. That makes some more sense. Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Iran. Okay. But now when Syria has a new government and is saying that it has no beef with Israel, and when there's an internal matter, which is the fighting between jihadi groups and the Druze in Suwaida, then Israel strikes near the presidential palace and really, raised a lot of eyebrows in the region. And now that you see that Israel is striking inside of a country which is not really an enemy country, right? They don't have full normalization, but it's definitely not is an enemy country in any way, right? There's officials that go back and forth all the time. And again, they did have official relations for a while as well. So if Israel is willing to do that because of threats to Israel and stuff going on inside those countries, I think some of them are saying, well, if there was something that Israel identified in the UAE or in Saudi Arabia, what would Israel do if there was some sort of threat? And this seems to be that they see Israel as defining national security in purely military terms and not in other terms. Of course, there's many elements of national security: economic, intelligence, diplomatic, elements of soft power. But Israel seems to be harming itself in those other ways just for the pure military, to strike Hamas. Now, it could be that since that could end the war more quickly, that'll open up diplomacy, maybe, but I don't think that's the way it's being read. So I think this really alarmed a lot of these countries, and they think that Israel is getting a little bit too strong, or is acting in a manner that's too aggressive and that is hitting too close to home.
Okay, we've been talking about the Abraham Accords, which is celebrating 5 years next week, September 15th. When we sit down in another 5 years, Lazar Berman, diplomatic correspondent, or by then king of the world,
At least king of times of Israel.
at the very least, what do you foresee we'll be discussing by then? Which countries, for example?
I think there's a chance that the Saudi 5 years is a long time, Middle East, right? Will Netanyahu still be in power? Potentially, but he's probably not. Probably not. He's getting up there. He deserves a calm retirement. Trump likely will not have figured out a way to still be president. So you'll have President Vance, and the Saudis will probably have the MBS might be the actual king by then. But basically, the interest will largely be the same, you would imagine, for all these countries. So it's quite conceivable that Israel will have figured out the Saudi issue, especially if you say this war will likely have ended by 5 years, and this government will not, it won't be. They'll be able to say that it's a different government, and if another government is able to commit to some sort of, broad process about a Palestinian state, then it's quite possible. Once the Saudis do it, then I think it would open up to some of the other countries we mentioned, the Kuwaitis. The relationship with Qatar, who knows where it'll go, right? Because Qatar is such a Jekyll and Hyde country, right? On one hand, Al Jazeera and its ties with the Muslim Brotherhood. On the other hand, it tries to present itself as a kind of moderate and pro-Western country. So it could be that we have ties with Qatar, but it could be that things have gotten much worse. I think the big one I'd be worried about is Turkey. I'm going to take this in a different direction. The trend in Turkey is bad. I think it was Bernard Lewis who said that Iran will become Turkey and Turkey will become Iran, so that it's inevitable that the secularist tendencies of Iran will win out, and they'll get rid of their religious dictators, whereas Turkey, the religiousness and extremism of much of the population will overthrow the secular nature of the regime. So I think that is something that we'd have to be concerned about. There's a chance that Iraq could actually be there. Could it be that someone gets serious about a Kurdish state and we're there? Absolutely. So there are definitely possibilities, but what has to happen is this war has to end. I think that a different government, I'm not saying necessarily a non-Netanyahu government, but if it's a government without Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and with some more, kind of sober-headed people that care more about the diplomacy in the Arab world and understand what these countries want, then there's a chance that things could have expanded. And of course, it depends who's in the office in the White House. Who knows if it's Democrats again? You don't know if it'll be a younger Democrat who's more hostile to Israel and is more interested in making problems for Israel than actually expanding peace in the region. But if it's someone from the Republican Party who wants to build on what Trump has done, then I think the chances would be much better.
Okay, I'm going to print out every single thing you said, put it in a glass jar, and bury it in my garden, and we'll speak again in 5 years, okay?
Let's do it. I've marked it down on my calendar.
All right, great. Lazar, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Amanda. Good to be back.
And Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thanks for listening to this week's Friday Focus. Please check out another installment next week. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, Shalom.